just about the Democrats. I think this is a reaction to this particular president and the perception of the way that he has attacked women and otherwise devalued some of the issues that they very much care about.
Erol, is this a president who's got his wings clipped now? Not going to be able to have things all his own way by a long chalk now?
Well, in some ways, the results that came out were certainly not as we had hoped. Obviously, losing the House wasn't the goal, but having his wings clipped is certainly going a little bit too far. There was quite a bit of positive news for our side of the aisle. We won tremendous victories in Florida, Missouri, Indiana, Texas, especially gubernatorial races, getting those Senate seats, and kind of energizing the base and galvanizing it for 2020. So, there's a little bit of glass half full. I'm not here to lie to you. Of course, it wasn't a victory for us to have lost the House, but it wasn't a tremendous loss either.
Okay. And Amy, what about that? What's your take on that? Is this now a diminished President Trump who's perhaps looking at being a one-term president, or is it not as serious as that?
It is quite serious. So the issue here is that President Trump no longer has the ability to implement his agenda without serious interruption. The fact that the House is now controlled by the Democrats means that the Democrats are going to be holding him accountable and his administration officials for any of their actions. So that's point one. The second issue, though, is that the Democrats have the purse strings now. The House is the place where the budget originates. And that means that President Trump can have all sorts of policy ideas, but he's not going to get them implemented without the funding.
Do you think, though, Amy, that this is in some way a situation which Trump can play to his advantage? He's never been one for sort of detailed policy pronouncements and a sort of normal legislative program. What he likes is to be able to say that the political elites are getting in his way, that Washington's a swamp, that it needs to be drained. Is that a story that he might be able to tell with more effect, even though he's lost the House, or perhaps because he's lost the House?
I think he'll tell that story no matter what. He told the same story when he had both houses of Congress, so we shouldn't really expect that to change. But the meaningful reform here is that he will now have to present documents to Congress. His administration officials will have to explain themselves to Congress. And to the extent that the Mueller investigation leads to any meaningful suggestion of criminal wrongdoing, the president is going to have to account for that. And that is a major development that he should not underestimate.
Erol, that's true, isn't it? That there's going to be now a very, very considerable level of investigation into the president, into his tax affairs, for instance, from the House of Representatives, which simply wasn't there before.
Natural way to look at it, to build upon that, there's easily movements for impeachments of Trump and Kavanaugh. Right now, they have a choice to either work with the Republicans on infrastructure, prison reform, border security, or they can grandstand, conduct hearings, and not legislate, which is going to be great for us in 2020. I dare you to try to impeach him. But more importantly, if you look at those situations, it's not quite as dire as perhaps it's being put out on the left. We don't see it that way. We welcome any investigation. There's no evidence for Mueller to find. He's been out there for 2 years. If you want to open his tax records, fine. The guy's a businessman. Nobody's going to take that away from him. So if you think that these things are going to be what finally stops Donald Trump, I just don't buy it. I mean, we're not worried about that at all.
And you're not worried that this set of election results can sort of be the beginning of a slippery slope which will end in a one-term presidency?
Oh, quite to the contrary. There's only been 5 times in the last 105 years that an incumbent president has won seats in the Senate in an off election year. I mean, the amount of places we lost in the House were much less than some predictions, and we even picked up seats in the Senate. Everybody knows that a House race is going to be much different than a Senate race. It's indicative of many different factors. So certainly, if anything, this galvanizes the base. It gives them a reality check. You can't be perhaps as ineffectual as legislative bodies have been on all sides over the last 50 years and get away with just sitting there. So it was a referendum on Donald Trump in two different ways. One way of taking it is that, the House has been lost and therefore this is going to continue a further slope. But really, if you look at a lot of the swing states, a lot of the Midwest, a lot of Florida especially, which is really important, it's an electoral college election. We live in a republic democracy. We don't live in some tyrannical mob rule country. So ultimately, we don't see it that way.
Okay. Amy, what's certainly true is that the Democrats would have to do considerably better than this if they are to make Trump a one-term president. Do they have the capacity to bring forward as a presidential candidate the kind of radical figures, the women that won for them in this congressional race?
Look, I'm not sure that the American people want radical figures. They want people who are going to bring forward sensible solutions to the very real issues that the United States faces in the 21st century. So I wouldn't say that this is about finding the most radical figures. I think this is about finding candidates who are serious people, who are inspiring, who can unite the country rather than divide the country and provide way forward.
I think we've lost that link there. Erol, from your point of view, what kind of Democrat do you think would provide the most challenging opponent for Donald Trump? I mean, Amy, I think before we lost her there was saying, well, not necessarily the most radical candidate, but certainly in the last presidential contest with Hillary Clinton, the most establishment candidate didn't cut the mustard.
Well, yeah, that's actually a very good point. Who does the Democrats have to run? I mean, if you look at some of the early frontrunners, you got Joe Biden out there threatening to punch people, take them out back of the schoolyard. There's candidates like Bernie Sanders who could have, I would admit, would have had a much better chance against Trump the first time around. You can go for some renegade candidates like Kamala Harris or try that risk. But if I was a Democrat right now, you have Beto. People like a handsome face. They're not so concerned with all the substance. Money got behind him. I think that would be one of the most realistic challenges for them to put up. But then again, they have a tendency to not play their best cards to their own detriment. So we will see. I don't see any challenger emerging really that could challenge Trump in any sort of key state right now. But we live in a developing political field. Anything can happen.
Are you happy with an electoral system which this time and in the presidential election revealed a society as deeply divided as America is at the moment? I mean, after all, the Republicans ran an ad campaign that even Fox News was so appalled at that it wouldn't run it.
Well, sure. There is an element of American politics that has degraded. I did some study at UC Berkeley, and I saw firsthand the way that can go both ways. Certainly, advertisements that could be considered dog whistles should be looked at, and there is a lot of controversy around the Trump candidacy. You can go back to his election, the comments he made about Mexicans, but then he got a big Latino vote. He made a lot of comments about Muslims, but I was an immigrant from a Muslim nation, and many Turkish, many Pakistani also voted for him because they look past some of those glaring sort of issues that the left really likes to amplify and put on the front burner, and they sort of overplayed their hand by calling a crying wolf every single day for 2.5 years. It didn't do them any good.
I think we've got Amy back on the line. Amy, you were making the point that you didn't necessarily think that the Democrats should go for a more radical candidate, but the last time out, when they chose a very, very establishment figure in Hillary Clinton, that just didn't work either, did it?
I think there's a difference between choosing someone who has a long and complicated history, including on the political stage for many years, and choosing someone who is sensible. And there's a big difference there. What we see with President Trump is really dividing people based on their race, based on their background, based on their sexual orientation. And I think the result of this election suggests that message doesn't resonate with the majority of Americans. So the lesson that Democrats need to take from that is who will unite the country, who will speak for a majority of the population, and who can provide real solutions to the many issues that Americans are facing, whether it's health care or the opioid crisis, or education, or any number of issues that impact people's bottom line.
So there's nothing in these results in terms of the radical candidates that were very successful. Nothing in the Bernie Sanders campaign last time round that moves you to the point of view of saying, look, the Democratic establishment just haven't got the answer now.
I think what we saw in these results really reflects a level of frustration and anger with the way the president has held the office for the past 2 years. I think it's pushing forward a candidate like Brett Kavanaugh, despite pretty serious allegations of wrongdoing and partisanship, galvanized women, getting more women than ever to the polls. It galvanized Latinos. It galvanized people who feel like they are under threat at the moment. And that's the lesson that we need to take away, is that the divisive, hateful rhetoric is not a pattern that any Democrat should be adopting.
Erol, what's your feeling when you hear that if the Democrats certainly follow Amy's advice, that they'll stick to the kind of centre ground and hope that Trump's way of doing politics just alienates so many people that they kind of come through as the victors? Do you think that's a workable strategy?
To adopt Trump's strategy or to counteract it?
To kind of stick to the old triangulation formulations of Bill Clinton, hope that the middle ground carries you through?
Well, I think with this change in the House, there's a lot of room for bipartisanship. And I totally agree. The vitriol, the hate, the violence on both sides certainly isn't what is helping Americans. At the end of the day, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, whatever you are, we're all Americans and we all want what's best for each other. So I think this is a very good opportunity for the Democrats to step up and, take a leadership role in bringing that cohesion back. Because Donald Trump is a very flexible guy. He's a deal maker. You can laugh, but he's willing to work with people as long as they come and work with him. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I have a lot of Democratic friends, and they echo that. They don't want to see the impeachments or the attempts on Justice Kavanaugh. But there is that radical faction, and that radical faction has gained traction on almost all sides of all political parties around the world, and they might end up being beholden to that. I mean, you have a Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. I mean, at some point, where is the new, where is the old? We have new people coming in. There can be fractions in their party. So I think it's best to look for common ground, such as infrastructure, prison reform, these kind of things that all Americans get behind, healthcare reform, even border security. That's not just a Republican concept. My family came, across legally. It's a very big, meaningful thing to us. And immigration certainly is something that transcends any political or racial demographic. So I think there's a lot of room for cohesion.
And Amy, final question now. What do you think this result will mean in terms of President Trump's attitude towards the balance of domestic and foreign policy? Is it likely to be a result which pushes him more to attention to foreign policy as a way of perhaps avoiding some of the questions that might be asked in the House of Representatives?
Well, there are two paths here. On the one hand, he is going to have to devote a considerable amount of resources to responding to congressional oversight and to making sure that he has his ducks in a row on the domestic side. And the question is whether that distracts him from his foreign policy. On the other hand, as you say, he may find that becomes quite contentious and he'd do more on the foreign policy stage. And frankly, that is a place where he still has room to maneuver because that particular role is one that the president by the Constitution has a lot more of a role to play. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him pivot in that direction. I wouldn't be surprised to see more of some of what we've seen in terms of alienating some of the allies, ramping up the rhetoric, and trying to distract the American public from the real domestic problems he'll be facing at home.
Okay, well, we'll have to end that discussion there. My thanks to Amy Pope from Chatham House and to Erol Morkoc from Republicans Abroad for discussing the issues that came out of last night's midterm election results. Well,